There's been reports that X was still, after 5 days of being officially banned in Brazil, it was still the top of the ISO App Store, so the Apple App Store. It was still at the top. Allegedly, the only reason I can see why it still would be if people are using VPNs and potentially not getting fined from doing so, because there was talk about fining people using VPNs to still use X in the jurisdiction. This week, we also saw that Brandon Carr send a quite in-depth letter to his counterparts in the Brazilian telecoms industry. Now, those who don't know, Mr. Carr is specifically high up in the FFC, which is the regulatory body in America for communications and how we go about them. They're quite similar to Ofcom in the UK. Within this letter, he also implies or says that the threats to pull Starlink's licenses and authority, or those approvals from those regulators in Brazil, was actually unlawful under Brazil's own constitution and your own country's statutory requirements against anti-government corruption, as well as also sharing the view about Brazil that in fact, quote, in fact, the US business leaders are now openly questioning whether Brazil is on the path to becoming an uninvestable market. He also added that Brazilians should not be put up to the government suppressing a specific political viewpoint, end quote. He does end the letter by requesting a meeting to, quote, resolve these issues, end quote. The full letter I will link down below as well. So there's clearly mounting pressure, and it does actually sound as if that quite a lot of what Alex is doing is very illegal, if not slightly illegal, in that respect, and it does seem as to be quote unquote government overreach, you could say, in that respect. So I'm sure many of you and I are watching, no matter whether you agree with the ban or not. I would feel that you would hope that Alex specifically is going to have to go after the ban legally, and wouldn't want to do anything unlegally to do so. And as I alluded to, and as some of the articles that I referenced in last show kind of made the feeling that he was going after anything that he could related to Elon and not looking at, okay, well, X is the thing that I've got a problem with or I have an issue with and I'm going to shut that down. And then over here we've got Starlink, that is a separate company, separate shareholders, happens to be owned by the same person, but should I enforce that? Now, Starlink did muddy the waters specifically by not making very clear from the beginning that they would uphold the ban. So I guess your counter argument there could be that by them doing that, they potentially left the court in a position where if it didn't act, then it would be perceived as saying, oh, well, yeah, Starlink, that's fine. Just walk around our ban and don't enforce it. But was it a bit heavy-handed, you could say, from Alex specifically to potentially, go after those assets of Starlink and basically cease them to be able to operate as a business? And fair play to them, they still offered free internet access because they literally cannot, all their assets are frozen, all of their bank accounts are frozen, so they can't transact with any of their customers to be able to get their deposits or to get their monthly subscriptions or to get their product specifically paid for. But they were very, very clear in the respect to they're going to keep their Brazilian customers online. And as I alluded to in last show as well, there is a percentage of Brazil that really do rely on Starlink to stay connected to the internet because of the geo nature of how Brazil is. There is only a few providers that can actually have 100% internet coverage across the region, because Starlink being one of them, because of the way that, you've got a lot of jungle, you've got a lot of other difficult terrains that exist within Brazil as well. Adding to the pressure pushing on the Brazilian authorities, specifically Senator Marcos Rubio, released the following statement as well after hearing about the X ban. Quote, "For some time, I've heard about the ongoing government censorship campaign in Brazil. The recent decision to ban X undermines basic freedoms from individuals and private entities who wish to seek information from X, and imposing a legal censorship campaign. The people of Brazil are facing a very serious crackdown on engaging in social media platforms for the sake of basic freedoms and a bipartisan relationship. Brazil should basically undo this move or think about this next move very carefully," and that's something that we're seeing from some quite powerful people or quite notable people inside the US government, and as I said, the US governing regulators as well. So it looks like potentially there may be some reaction from investment into the country from government sources, but also private sector as well, regarding this quote-unquote going after freedom of speech, because America notoriously has the First Amendment and was built on the concept of freedom of expression and freedom of speech. We also in the UK have laws regarding the freedom of expression specifically, and protecting those specific rights is important to both of those nations, because it is perceived and known that it's one of the only ways that you can have a free, open, democratic society, if you're allowed to critique what the government is doing and not have a quote-unquote totalitarian state. Now, arguably, you could say, and some people have reported, that the current state of affairs in the UK at the moment is moving closer to a totalitarian state. I'm not going to get into whether it is or isn't, but some people have said that. And I think it's important to ask ourselves and establish, if that is true, is that a way we want to go as a country? Is that a way we want to go as a community? And by the sound of it, it definitely looks like the US doesn't want to see government corruption and high levels of censorship regarding the information and what can and can't be discussed. Now, there's a difference, I think, and I think we need to be very careful, and this is why we talk about it and why we're talking about misinformation and why the conversation is so loud at the moment, is there is a difference between factually not correct and an opinion that doesn't actually connect or align with the more popular view, and I think they're very different. I think we need to tackle them very differently. And of course, by the way, this goes without saying that this isn't necessarily true on 95% of platforms, because a platform is a private entity and a private business and can choose to cease service like you would in a restaurant or any other business. They can say, no, we don't want you here for any reason or etc. But there should be a process and there should be transparency on why that reasoning is, in my view, and why and how the people, the account, the people who made the decision, the platform, the organization should take accountability for the decisions they make as well. Within last week's show, I also talked about the fact that there was potentially going to be calls for a large quote-unquote freedom march or freedom movement to take place, and it does look like a large gathering did take place, but from the research that I can do, it was mostly to show political support rather than the full rally to necessarily be about freedom of speech, although it was mentioned and a percentage of the crowd were there for that reason. It's unclear at this stage to see whether the whole thing was done specifically for freedom of speech. In 95% of cases in the articles and the researches I've actually done on this at the moment up to this show, and I'll leave what I have written down below, it sounded like it was more specifically, I'm going to support X person in politics. I'm going to expect this person's view, and it was their supporters and their fans and their people who would support their ideology, rather than necessarily, which part of which is freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of speech specifically, and freedom of expression, that they would be there. So it was kind of mixed. It wasn't solely a freedom march, as has been alluded to by some people on X, but it also wasn't solely not to do with that either. So like many things, it's nuanced, and like many things, it's mixed. But at the moment, that's all we know. There is other stuff that I didn't talk about necessarily, other opinions and other points of view that I'll leave down in the description down below. Some other articles I found really, really useful, but I didn't want to necessarily bring quotes in or talk about them specifically, but they'll be down in the description down below for those who are interested. Thank you ever so much for listening